Welcome to Summon Your Superhuman. I'm here live with my beautiful guest, Tanya Wilson, who is a psychotherapist specializing in narcissistic abuse. So I'm not going to go into a long spiel about your accreditations because I know you have many, but I just want to welcome you to the show, Tanya.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm very excited about this. We've been wanting to do this for quite some time now.
Yeah.
But diving into your line of work, because it's very niche and it's very specific, isn't it?
Yeah.
So how long have you been doing counselling work and psychotherapy?
Well, officially, I've been doing it for 10 years. So I moved into the counselling space after being a massage therapist for a long time. So I kind of divided up into being an incidental counsellor, where I was doing a lot of incidental counselling as a massage therapist. There's probably a lot of hairdressers and massage therapists out there that can understand what I'm saying. And then I moved into the space of being just a counsellor. So I retrained as a counsellor psychotherapist in 2011 and 2012. And so I'm just about to hit that 10-year mark of being in the profession for 10 years. So, yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So I assume that, you would have started more on a broad spectrum of clientele at that time.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And that's a really interesting process. And, it's actually part of what I help new counsellors with now. So I have, people that are just starting out in the industry, having some mentoring or supervision with me. And this is one of the things that I explain to them is that, everyone says when you start a business, you've got to find your niche. But at the beginning, it's actually really hard to work out exactly what that is, because you usually don't know yet where your specialty areas lie. And so I found, definitely for myself personally, but as I watch other people going through the same process, it usually takes a few years of just trying a few different things and, being available to a whole broad range of people. And then over time, you slowly start to learn kind of where you fit in, where you can, help or heal in the best way. And that's definitely was my experience. So, the first couple of years, it was fairly broad and general. But then, I think probably after about 2 years, I started to get really, you get the same types of clients benefiting the most from the work that you do. And so I realized, oh gosh, nearly everyone that's coming to see me is coming to see me for similar things. And that was in that area of emotional or narcissistic abuse. So I started to recognize it more from what I was seeing showing up than it being a mental process of, oh, this is what I want to specialize in. Yeah.
Well, there must have been an element of you finding that an easier, well, not easier, but a more somewhat, you know what I'm trying to say, an easier process of leading people through for some reason.
Yeah.
Would you say that there is another reason for you kind of finding your feet so naturally in that field?
Yeah. And it's really interesting because kind of going through that as a therapist and noticing this niche area kind of arriving, it did help me to reflect on, why am I so good at this? Why am I able to help people in this particular area? Why am I helping more in this area than perhaps in other areas? And as I did that reflective process, I really started to recognize that those sorts of things had happened in my life. So obviously was already aware of it. Going through counselling training is very intensive in that way. So a lot of counselling training is about going through your own process and learning about yourself and about what you've been through. So everything that we learn as a counsellor, we've actually got to experience that ourselves in terms of the techniques and processes. So you actually go through quite a lot of therapy and counselling in training. And so I'd had quite a few realizations in that process of being trained as a counsellor, that I had quite a few relationships that were emotionally abusive. And I was able to start to put words to that and understand that. And also through that training, understand really what abuse was, So people kind of throw around that word a lot, abuse, domestic violence or domestic abuse. But to actually learn what it really is and to get some very definite language for what it is and for what it isn't, and to understand the differences was really helpful for me to get, oh, actually, I have been through this. I thought that other people had been through worse, which is interesting because I often hear that in sessions with clients as well. We always think that other people have had it worse, or that, oh, I shouldn't really talk about this because I'm sure, there are other people that have been through much more than what I've been through. So we tend to minimize or diminish our experience of abuse because we think that abuse needs to be this great, big, horrendous, horrific thing. But, there are lots of different forms of abuse and lots of different levels of abuse, but all of it's traumatizing. And so, part of, I guess, me learning about myself through counselling training and just through my own personal therapy meant that I did have an understanding that I'd experienced emotional abuse. But then as I started to learn more about narcissistic abuse and narcissistic personality types, I could really match up this very specific area where emotional abuse happens, but there's also quite a few other things that kind of come in and create an atmosphere of narcissistic abuse as well. So yeah, that definitely helped me to articulate that and identify that for clients as well.
Yes. Well, lucky you, because I had struggled to niche down in what I do and still am refining that process. So to be able to find your niche, and even doctors, there's 42, they divide the body into like 42 different types of specialties, whereas we're like one whole person. So it's a journey. And I had a psychologist used to say that everybody that was studying psychology was there for their own therapy. And another thing you said as well, therapists have therapists. Which is coaches should have coaches. And the language was what stood out to me just then, was how the description of abuse, because I think this is a really interesting topic. And then, so going back to what you were saying, because that was a light bulb moment for you, clearly, is that language around abuse. Do you mind sharing that with us?
Absolutely, and I think language is so important, and there can be a lot of healing that comes from being able to find words for something. So essentially, as human beings, we're all meaning-making creatures. We want to make meaning out of our experiences. And to be able to do that verbally, to find language or to find words that expresses exactly what we've been through, can be very helpful and very healing. And so in terms of definitions around abuse, and types of abuse and things like, narcissistic abuse and emotional abuse, to get some definition around that, I usually kind of break it down into very small parts. And so when I'm talking about narcissistic abuse with clients, for example, I talk about the 8 abuses of narcissistic abuse. But let's just kind of focus on maybe what abuse is first. And then if you're interested, I can talk about what the 8 abuses of narcissistic abuse are. But abuse in itself is basically a boundary violation. So naturally as human beings, we all have personal boundaries, and we have personal boundaries in a few different areas. So the way that I like to break it down, and there are a few different kind of concepts or philosophies around this, but the way that I like to describe it is that we have external boundaries and internal boundaries. The external boundaries are more of our physical and sexual boundaries, and our internal boundaries are more of our kind of listening and receiving or talking boundaries. So, the internal boundaries are more about what we hear, what we read, and what we say and what we write, whereas the external boundaries are more physical or sexual. And so anytime that there's been a violation of any of those boundaries, that's where we start to go into the area of abuse. So anytime something's projected at you, becomes abuse. And so people get confused a little bit about anger. So I might use that as an example about when it's a boundary violation. So, for example, with anger, somebody can be angry in your presence and be expressing anger, but it doesn't necessarily need to be abusive. When it becomes abusive is when it starts to violate one of your boundaries. So if that anger means that someone is yelling at you or calling you names, or raising their voice to a point where it's harmful for you or hurting you, then that's a boundary violation. But if someone's just kind of gone angry and gone, oh, I'm so pissed off about that, that's very different to someone expressing it at you or towards you and violating your boundaries. And so, anger in itself is a naturally occurring emotion. Anger is okay to express. We're allowed to express anger as an emotion as a human being. But when it becomes abusive is when we project that at someone else, when we make that about someone else or give it to someone else. And then that becomes a boundary violation. So in terms of the boundaries that I talked about before, that may be affecting someone's physical boundary as well as their internal boundary, their listening boundary, where it's like, oh, I didn't need to hear that, or that was mean, or that was cruel, or that was hurtful. So that would be examples of that boundary violation, and then therefore it becomes abusive, rather than just being an emotion that you're witnessing someone else go through.
Yep.
But have I explained that? Does that make sense in terms of abuse and the definition?
Yeah, I think very much so, because when we talk about someone expressing any emotion around us, be it happy, sad, even, it's only when that's projected towards you or a person at somebody. You could be sad and still projecting that at someone, like, and then then it becomes like it's projected like their fault that you're crying, so that's also what you're speaking about. So I think that absolutely. And that particular instance that example that you gave, I see that a lot in the boundaries between parents and young children. So for example, if a parent is going through depression or sadness or going through a breakup or something like that, and they're experiencing a lot of sadness, that can kind of spill out over the child in their presence, and that becomes then like a micro trauma for that child, where the child feels responsible for or feels like they've got to calm or heal or soothe mum or dad. And it's not the job of a child, but that's another example of when an emotion can become harmful for someone else because it's been a boundary violation. Whereas if that parent is sobbing in front of their child, but kind of owning that emotion and I guess containing it to a certain extent as well, then it's not spilling out over the others that are in their environment. So I think coming back to boundaries and noticing when we're containing ourselves appropriately as opposed to spilling out over someone else, that can be a great way of noticing whether something's abusive or not. So I think then diving into a more specific, and your niche is narcissistic abuse. So how would you describe that?
And this is one of the things that early on in the piece became really evident to me, that people that had been through narcissistic abuse, as in the client showing up, presented in a very different way to other forms of domestic violence or domestic abuse. And I believe the reason behind that is because narcissistic abuse is so layered, and there's so many layers of abuse that happen with narcissistic abuse. So over time, I've been able to identify this as 8 different types of abuse. And so when someone's experienced narcissistic abuse, they usually would have experienced several of these 8, if not all 8. So not everyone experiences all 8, but most people are up around 5 or 6 of these types of abuse. So the types of abuse are mental abuse, emotional abuse, and emotional abuse is probably the most obvious and the most prevalent. So mental abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse. And physical abuse doesn't just include you know, when someone's violating your body, hitting you or slapping you, or other examples that you might imagine. But it can also involve if someone is doing something to your environment that's potentially scaring you, or you know, elevating your nervous system. So for example, throwing something in your direction, even if it's not designed to hit you, but designed to perhaps scare you, that can be physical abuse as well. And I think that's important for people to know, that physical abuse isn't just those extreme examples that we hear about. It's also to do with our environment and our property, you know. And so mental, emotional, physical, and then we have spiritual abuse, which in terms of narcissistic abuse, this can often be around how then we view the world. So often when people, prior to being in a narcissistic relationship, prior to that, they might have a concept or an idea that everyone has good in them, you know, that everyone just innately has good in them. Sometimes it might be hard to find for some people, but we all have that seed of good. But then when they go through something like narcissistic abuse, they come out the other side of that going, I don't know if I can believe that anymore. I've had this experience where I don't know if that's true anymore. And so that can be part of spiritual abuse, where someone has kind of tampered with or changed the way that we, you know, changed our belief systems, changed the way that we view the world, our worldview. But it can also be things like manipulating or controlling people to adopt certain religions, or to be part of a cult, or to even incite themselves as the spiritual leader in their life, you know. So sometimes with narcissistic personality types, they don't want you to have your own beliefs, they want you to believe in them. So all of those things are kind of wrapped up in spiritual abuse. And then we've got financial abuse, which is pretty self-explanatory as well. And in narcissistic abuse, we also have legal abuse, and that's something that's very prevalent these days, where the abuse is happening after the breakup of a relationship, but continues on through the abuse of the legal system, where there's a lot of lying and manipulating to implicate the victim. So that's 6. What have I stepped through? Mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, legal, and financial. And we've also got verbal abuse as well. So verbal abuse is can be part of mental abuse, but verbal abuse is kind of like an area all of its own as well.
That's it's very insightful.
There's a lot, isn't there?
It's a lot. I'm sitting with it.
Pause. I go through this most days, you know, talking about these different types of abuses with people, and I might not spell it out like I have just here, but just through natural conversation, you know, at least several of these forms of abuse will come up in conversation with clients that are wanting recovery from narcissistic abuse. So I forget sometimes that people hearing about this for the first time, that in itself can sound overwhelming, you know. So if you are listening to this and you are finding, just hearing me step through how diverse and how much abuse is contained in narcissistic abuse, then, you know, take time to look after yourself. Just pause and breathe, take a big deep breath, just like you just did. It's like, oh, wow, that's a lot, you know. And this is why narcissistic abuse is so traumatizing, because, you know, we haven't even talked about the examples of those abuse. We've just stepped through the different sorts of abuse that can happen, and already that's a lot to deal with, right?
100%.
So it's very telling.
Definitely. And so I guess in your profession, what do you find like is that, you know, because people have to go through this process, and they might not necessarily, like you didn't, you know, have that association to, I've just gone through a form of abuse, because, you know, to put it in lay terms, obviously we just think, oh, that was a really shit relationship. You know, what an ass, right? Like we, you know, we use this kind of like colloquial language where we're just like, that was terrible, never do that again, you know. But when you really dissect it, then that's when you start to think about these terms and these ways of looking at it and going, well, actually, you know, that's a form of abuse.
Yeah.
And the hardest thing to do is when you're in it.
Yes.
You don't actually, you're the most blind to it, because obviously if you're in what you think is a loving relationship at the time, and and I can speak some truth into that too. I've spoken openly about it before. It's like when you're in it, you don't see it.
Yeah.
And so then you're going through those things, and I'm thinking in my head, oh yeah. But like, so a boundary that I had always set is, if you physically put your hands on me in the wrong way, we're done. So I've always, like, if I have any inclination that there's been any physical wrongdoing, I remember an ex grabbed my arm in a little bit of a rough manner at a nightclub. And I was like, if you ever touch me like that again, you will never see me again.
Yeah.
Like, that's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But on the flip side of that, then exactly what you're saying, it's like, by destroying things in the environment that made me feel uncomfortable, that's also and that was interesting. So that was a light bulb moment for me. I'm like, because it is, you just think, oh, it's having a temper tantrum, all that sort of stuff. But when it's projected at you, because you're the cause of the anger, of course, and then that and that verbal and and that verbal and abusive. So I guess part of my pause as well was going, so interesting. And a lot of people, I'm sure, would have no idea. And going back to where I opened with that is, when you're in it, you've really got no idea. So then do you find is it when people are kind of going through that journey of self-discovery, or I guess they're trying to re-enable or rediscover themselves, is that when they would find someone like you to just be like, to help them through that process?
Sometimes and that's really interesting. So sometimes that will show up where someone has, and the internet's an amazing thing and an amazing resource for this sort of stuff now these days. And so you can literally go on and you can type in a few keywords about how you're feeling, and then all of a sudden all this information starts to pop up, right? And you might have seen the word narcissism or narcissistic abuse, or you might have seen the term emotional abuse in some Google search, and then you kind of go down those rabbit holes, you start researching and looking and going, oh yeah, that's how I feel. Oh yeah, that's what's been happening to me. Oh, someone else has had that experience. And so most people come into therapy off of that type of experience where they've been feeling like something's not quite right, not totally understanding what's happening, but then through their own research, listening to, watching YouTube or listening to an audio book or doing some Google searching and reading a few articles, they're like all of a sudden informed that, hang on a minute, this experience sounds like someone that's gone through narcissistic abuse or someone that's being emotionally abused. And then that's when they usually start doing the how can I get help for this kind of Google searches, and then finding someone like myself that specializes in the area of narcissistic or emotional abuse. However, with emotional and narcissistic abuse, there is also and I'd say it's probably about 50-50, about 50% of the people that find me because they've had to change who they are and they don't like who they're becoming. And they don't yet realize that they're in an abusive relationship. They think they're the abuser. And I know this is going to resonate for some people that are listening to this, because this is very common and we're often blindsided, like you said before. When we're in it, we can't see it. And so some people, about 50% of people, will find me because they think they are a narcissist, or they think that they are an abuser, because all of a sudden they've become a very angry, perhaps even violent, perhaps even manipulative person. And they're looking at themselves and their own behavior and going, hang on a minute, I never used to be like this until I went into this relationship. I was always calm and relaxed and I'd never speak to anyone in this way, but now I'm doing all these kind of aggressive things and speaking in ways or doing things that I wouldn't normally do. But in terms of the narcissistic abuse cycle, what is usually happening there is that person's being provoked and backed into a corner so much and so often that their only resource is to become like the person that is abusing them, and to basically hit back, to push back on that person that's been provoking them so much. The only other alternative to that is to completely shut down and to become a shell. And unfortunately, some people do that as well. But the people that are able to come in are usually the people coming in off of that mentality of I've turned into an abusive person and how can I get help? And then through the counselling process, we unpack what's actually going on, and they then realise, well, hang on a minute, my abusive behaviour is in response to someone manipulating me, gaslighting me, provoking me, basically constantly crossing my boundaries, and I needed some way of pushing back on that.
Yeah. That's really interesting, like insight, because I can see why that would happen, but it's not something that I've given a whole lot of thought to before, and so that's really interesting. That's about, because it can go either way.
That's right.
Someone can tell you that oh, look at what you've made me do and how I am now, it's your fault, and then you start to actually believe it. It's like that thing, when you hear it enough, it works in the opposite effect too. You can say positive daily affirmations and believe that, but then at the same time, if you're getting negative daily affirmations, then you start to believe that as well.
Absolutely. And in fact, a lot of people, when they come into counselling, they may have already left that abusive person. They might not be in relationship with them anymore. And so they've come in to have some counselling and some therapy to help recover from that experience. But what a lot of people find is, even though that person's not in my life anymore, the tapes are still running. The programming's in my head now. And now I'm doing to myself what that abusive partner used to do to me. So the mental loops or tapes that we hear in our own head are just as destructive as when someone was doing that to us. And that's obviously part of the therapeutic process, is to recover from the trauma of having had that experience, but then also relearning and reprogramming our brain so that we don't then continue to do it to ourselves. Which is a very empowering process, but it can take a bit of time to erase one program and reinstall another.
Well, I think that also highlights what you'd said before about your situation isn't necessarily any less than anyone else's. It hits the same no matter what, to what degree you believe you're experiencing abuse or have seen it. Could be a friend of yours or whatnot, and that was brought to my attention when I spoke at a conference for domestic abuse in the US, in this virtual world that we're in. And I was in a room speaking with women who, had guns held to their head and all that sort of stuff, really physical, horrifying situations. And I actually felt really uncomfortable, because then for a moment there I'm thinking, well, I'd gone through nothing in comparison to what you guys have gone through, right? Thinking, emotional, verbal abuse, I haven't had a gun to my head or anything like that. I stay in the relationship because of my own stupid reasons, really. No, I'm kidding, but but that was really eye-opening. Because we compare. And then we downplay what we're going through because, that person over there is going through way worse, so I'll just deal with it.
The interesting thing as a psychotherapist is that over time, what I've learned is even people that have been through the most horrific experiences will still say things like, I shouldn't really complain because I know there are people that have been through worse than me. And sometimes I've had to say, actually, I don't know about that. That's probably up there with some of the worst things I've heard people talk about, and that can be really healing for someone to hear that of, oh, this is valid. But the way that I like to think about it is that there's no hierarchy of suffering. There's no hierarchy of suffering. Suffering is just suffering. So if you feel like you're suffering, that's all we need to know. If you're suffering because of something, then suffering is just how that is. There's no hierarchy.
So going back a little bit to your own situation, right? Because obviously, as the work that we do with people, a lot of ourselves comes out in it. So, you know, you had mentioned that you had gone through situations that you'd had identified as being abusive.
Yeah.
So then one, that obviously helps you relate to the people you speak to.
Yeah.
Even though you may not be able to share with them precisely what you've gone through in your, I might tend to share what I go through, but I'm not a professional therapist. I'm just but you know what I'm trying to say. So I guess because you were kind of going through a healing process yourself through that, I imagine.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting, you know, sometimes I'll get to the end of the session with a newer client. They might have seen me once or twice or something, and then they kind of go, I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you been through something like this too? Because you just seem to know exactly what I'm going through. So they can feel the resonance, you know, and they can feel the resonance. And I think there's definitely skill involved in that, but there is also that part of, yes, I have personally had those similar sorts of experiences, you know. And so probably it's happened a few times, and this is common with narcissistic abuse, where someone will be in a relationship with a narcissist and then kind of get out of that relationship, but then because they're feeling so depleted and so traumatized by that experience, it is very easy to go into another relationship of a similar type. Might appear different on the surface, but actually they've engaged with another narcissist, because narcissists do tend to try and find people that they can easily manipulate or control. And when someone's been really depleted in a relationship, then that's usually a fairly common thing that they would be easily controlled or manipulated then. So that is common, and that was my experience as well. And so one of the most impactful experiences for me was when I was going through my counselling training and learning all about you know, all sorts of things, but some of the stuff that I learned about was around relationships and domestic abuse and domestic violence. I was actually in a narcissistic abusive relationship. It lasted for about 18 months, and there was a lot of confusion at the time, but really it was a great blessing that I was doing so much therapy and counselling and learning counselling at the time, because that helped me to have some skills to deal with what I was going through. But then out the other side of that, learning about narcissism, being able to reflect on that relationship and really articulate that, yes, in fact, that was what that was. There are a few different types of narcissists, and the one that was most impactful on me was the covert narcissistic relationship that I had. And so with covert narcissism, they don't appear as kind of charismatic or you know, with a typical narcissist, they're kind of like that salesman type, which they're very charming, they're out there, they're vivacious, they're using their charm to manipulate or coerce others. But a covert narcissist doesn't appear like that. A covert narcissist is very quiet, very introverted. They're usually attracted to things like art and history and kind of very refined practices. And they might also appear like kind of spiritual teachers or counselors even themselves, you know, people that are kind of, you know, come across like I'm here for other people, I'm not here for myself. So they have that whole kind of facade going. And so that was a very traumatizing relationship for me, but I definitely learned a lot about narcissism in that relationship.
Yeah, again, when you're in it, you know, you think, oh, this is the worst thing in the world, or coming out of it. And it's like looking back on your past. You've had these teachers. That have come in and given you the direct experience, the direct knowledge, and now the learnings from your own personal circumstances.
That's right. And having to basically create my own recovery journey from that. So I had to learn how to recover from it, not knowing at the time that I realized there was really nothing out there around recovery from narcissistic abuse. There is quite a bit now, which is great and helpful. But at the time I went through it, there was no map, there was no roadmap. And that's part of what I find really fulfilling and satisfying now, is that because I've had to create that roadmap for myself and learn how to recover from it, and all the specific intricacies that are involved in narcissistic and emotional abuse, it's a little different to recovery from other traumas or other abuses. And so having to kind of work that out on my own, I see that as a big blessing. It's a real gift, because I've had to do that work. I understand what works and what doesn't, and what's most helpful. Yeah.
I think one of the advantages of working with someone like you is you do have a very holistic approach to the recovery process, to the journey itself. It's not just, oh, you seem to have these, let's talk about getting you on a medication, or that just one blanket resolution. Like your approach seems to be, and because I'm talking about what I know of her, obviously we've not talked about this, but you seem to have a very broad view on how you help people through this journey. It's not just like focus on this one mental aspect. It's all the different things you mentioned earlier. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think I'm just that kind of a person anyway. Like I've always had that, I guess, worldview where everything's connected, you know. So I've just been like that. I'm a Tibetan Buddhist by not practicing at the moment, but I've had that training, and that's part of my history and who I am. And in Buddhism, you know, it is about the interconnectedness of all things. And so when I came to Buddhism, I felt like I was kind of coming home. You know, that was part of how I thought like that anyway. So I really resonated with a lot of the Tibetan Buddhist teachings and practices. And I feel like that has definitely informed me. You know, that experience in Buddhist teachings and meditation definitely informs me as a therapist. But also the type of training that I received, again, another experience where I received some training and then went, oh, this is just the way that I think anyway, you know. So I really resonated with the work, and that is transpersonal work or transpersonal counselling. And so officially my title is a transpersonal psychotherapist, and transpersonal literally means beyond the person or beyond the personality of the self. And so in transpersonal work, we're not just looking at the human, the person and their personality, we're looking beyond that. You know, we're looking to their spiritual resources, we're looking to their energy system, we're looking to what's existing beyond them, as well as what's inside of them. So it's kind of like the whole picture. So transpersonal and holistic kind of are good descriptions of how I work. And because of that, what we're actually doing is we're resourcing the unconscious and the subconscious of the person. And so if you think about the iceberg effect, you know, so you imagine an iceberg and here's the waterline here, and we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. You know, when we think about talking therapy, a lot of talking therapy concentrates on the tip of the iceberg. What's conscious? What are we able to talk about? What's front of mind? You know, what do we see? What are we acknowledging already? But in transpersonal work, we're going below that waterline into the bottom of the, you know, what's underneath the actual kind of main part of the iceberg, which exists underneath. And that's dipping into that unconscious or subconscious realm. We're really privileging that. We're giving space to privilege what's there in the unconscious and subconscious, because that's not stuff that we already know, right? That's stuff that we don't know. It might sometimes pop up in a dream, or we might have a moment where we're, you know, having a restful moment and something occurs to us. But usually in our day-to-day life, we're just in our day-to-day ordinary consciousness. We're not thinking about what's deep down below in that bottom of the iceberg. And so that really describes how I work with people. Is you already know this stuff up here, and we can talk about that a bit, but let's go down here where you wouldn't normally resource yourself and find what resources are in there and what information is in there.
It's beautiful. That's really where you get that deep inner work is it's most transformational.
Yes.
But I want to bring it back to your, so you had to basically create some sort of infrastructure. You know, you created the pillars, like you figured out the different elements. But then now you're back at this point where you were trying to figure out your own roadmap. So you're sort of designing it, you'd say, from scratch.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was totally a trial and error thing, and just grasping at whatever I could think of, whatever resources I'd learned, whatever I could think of to try and help me through that process. And for me, it wasn't a short process. Like, I'd say that was over about a 6 or 7 year process. And in fact, parts of that I'm still going through. Like, what I'm kind of getting to learn now is that it is just an ongoing process. I'm probably recovered from the trauma of it, because I can look back and really see those events like gifts. You know, I really, there's no feeling in my body, there's no charge in my body about how bad that was, or how much I suffered, or anything like that. I feel like I've had full recovery in that. But what I mean by still going through it is there's still learnings, there's still lessons that I'm discovering along the way because of those experiences. But in terms of the trial and error and what I learned, what I've kind of got to now is realizing that there are these 8 abuses. But from those 8 abuses, there are 4 traumas, 4 kind of trauma areas. And if we forget or don't unpack one of those areas, we can't get full recovery. And so the journey that I did for myself was recovering from the mental trauma, recovering from the emotional trauma, recovering from the spiritual trauma, and then lastly, which is where I've met you, is recovering from the physical trauma. And that's really to do with the nervous system, and full recovery in our nervous system, but also that's so intimately tied with how we move, what's happening in our body, how we see ourselves, our identity, all of that kind of stuff. So that's really like, well, it's definitely been the last frontier for me, but I also see that with a lot of clients, is that physical recovery is kind of the last bit. It's probably the most confronting bit, and therefore is usually the last bit. But also we need to recover from the brain fog and the mental and emotional traumas before we're ready to focus on the physical.
Yeah. And there is no, I guess, no right order and how to do it. And I love that you've mentioned how long this process has actually taken. So it's not, it's not an overnight thing. I think obviously a lot of to our detriment is, we think everything's going to be quick. Yeah. And I think if you really honor the process and allow yourself the time and not give yourself a deadline for when it's going to be, you're going to be resolved. And it's because even Tanya is a professional in this area. And, and she's just openly discussed that she herself has still been discovering layers. Yes. And in all honesty, what a blessing. Yeah. Okay. Because, don't ever think that your journey or your process is ever done. I think it's right. Like, we're alive. So we're always going to find these other little pockets and these little insights and introspectives into ourselves, our journey, what we've reflected. We can reflect back and look on, actually, that was a previous pattern that I had always engaged in. It doesn't seem like I've completely let go of that, and I'm ready to let go of that now. Things like that. Absolutely. And it's interesting that you talk about that in that way, because really what you've described there is the process of psychotherapy. And this is something that I really like to help people to understand, is that's the difference between psychotherapy and counselling. And so when we're looking at basically that ongoing process of personal development, some people might call it self-realization or self-actualization. When we're doing things to work towards that, that's the psychotherapeutic process. Whereas the counselling process is much more about, I have a problem or an issue and I need to work through it, and we're working through that. We're kind of getting to the end of that, and then that's resolved, and then the counselling process finishes. So counselling is more about issues and behaviour and how to deal with that, and psychotherapy is more about the soul development or the personal development, and working towards that, or that kind of continual journey really of self-actualization or self-realization. And of course there's crossovers in both, but just to kind of define it, that's a good way to define it. Yeah, beautiful. And I think recently I met a woman who, I was expressing to her that people only really come to someone like me, and I believe it's also the same for you. People only come to people like us when they're truly ready for change.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
You know, otherwise it's an intimidating, scary process.
Yeah.
Whereas we're totally not that way. Like, we're the nicest, you know, women, very supportive, warm. I mean, we're in Tanya's clinic today, and we're usually in mine, and it's the energy in here is really beautiful, Tanya. I can see why people feel very safe and supportive in your presence.
Oh, good.
Which is why we've been discussing a lot about where you feel there is a bit of a missing link, let's say. Something that you've noticed is a bit of a gap. Yes. With your clients. Yes. Do you want to share that part?
Absolutely. So for some reason, you know, socially, we tend to believe, or there is some people that believe that by focusing on your physical, that you're being superficial. And in fact, with things like narcissistic and emotional abuse, often we have so much kind of criticism and so much kind of verbal harm coming towards us about our bodies, about how we are, that we get very used to just kind of disconnecting from our bodies. But then there's also this kind of social norm of, if you focus on your body, you're being superficial. And this is the missing link that I've found recent times, and definitely as I've been working with you on my physical recovery, I've really noticed that, hey, it is actually okay to focus on this, and it's actually really important to focus on this. And if we don't focus on it, we're not going to get full recovery. And so the gap really would be believing and knowing that it's okay to nourish and nurture and really fully, truly look after this vessel that's carrying around the rest of you, you know, this physical body of ours, and how really important that is. So through meeting you and doing the work that we've done, like, there's just been layers and layers of that unfolding over the last year or so that I've been training with you, and you've been helping me so much in that. And as the physical body starts to recover, then there's another layer, you know, of physical recovery, and then the next layer comes up, and the next layer. But it really is, the gap is that, you know, being brave enough to look at yourself in the mirror and say, yeah, I don't recognize myself anymore. I don't look like the person that I know I am. And what am I going to do about that to reclaim this identity that was lost through narcissistic or emotional abuse?
Yeah.
Like,
courage is just exuding out of me right now. It's like you have to have courage. You know, it's not just like a moment where you go, I think I might make a change. It's like, you have to exercise courage. Because then that's when you can experience the change and the empowerment that you've been able to feel. You know, it's been my honor to witness you on this journey of like transformation on so many different levels, especially physically. Like I have muscles in places now, like, you know, and
it's been very funny.
And why not, you know, and completely out of your comfort zone, to your credit, to be coming into a gym, you know, where like your safe haven has been Pilates studios and yoga studios and all that nice, comfortable things. Whereas going into, when, you know, I was still in a commercial gym back then, was a completely scary place for you.
Definitely. Very confronting. Like, oh, I'm not used to this.
And doing things in a different way and learning different modes of how I practice, again, which is touching upon all of the different holistic layers of our lives, you know, even touching upon the spiritual aspects, which is obviously part of your healing process too, is just, you know, has been that spiritual side. And it's remarkable, you know, what can be achieved when you start to love yourself enough to actually honor yourself enough to do something scary that you know is going to benefit you. Because there's one thing to know and the other is to do, because people say, oh yeah, I know this, Rhea, I know and I'm like, yeah, but you actually don't, because you haven't done it. So you only truly know if you do. And so you knew a lot of stuff. You weren't coming into it blind. And you know, massage therapist for 20 years, I think it was.
25.
25, right? And so now she's found me and she's like, oh my God, where have you been as a remedial therapist? But yeah, it's incredible because you had the knowledge, but there were things that you weren't putting into practice that you didn't actually know truly because you hadn't done it.
That's right.
But then now you've done it and you're still doing it. You're going through the process. You're having all these aha moments.
Yeah.
Like, oh my goodness, like all these things about, diet. And I don't like using that word, but it's very easy to describe when we talk about nutrition. All these little connections that we make between, oh my gosh, I've been doing this for so long, but hang on a second, this is actually, why have I made this so hard for myself? So we tend to like self-sabotage and make things harder for ourselves than what they actually are. Anyway, I think I'm probably starting to go on a bit of a tangent myself, but I think that it's all relevant, right?
Definitely.
And I think that this is where we're sort of segueing to, is like when we really put our heads together and talked about where you feel like the next step is, because the whole reason how we met is a client of yours is a client of mine.
Yes.
And then you'd seen the transformation that she had made and went, holy, what the hell is going on?
What are you doing? How are you doing this? What's going on? Tell me.
Right. And so then you entered and you went, well, hang on, I think there's something here for me.
Yeah.
And so this kind of cross-pollination, I feel, is really beneficial. And I'm very excited because we're actually going to be pioneering something together that I believe it could have been done before, but I don't think it's going to be done the way that we're doing it. And I'm very excited to be doing it with you. And that is, you want to introduce it?
So we're doing a workshop together which is about and now I've gone completely blank on the name. Reclaiming, thank you, your health and your body after narcissistic abuse. Reclaiming your health and your body after narcissistic abuse. And so I'll be facilitating some work around how to kind of unpack that and the emotional and psychological parts of that. And then I've invited you to come and work with the people that are attending that workshop to work on the physical parts and kind of give them a little taste of what you introduced me to a year or more ago, because I really want them to have that same experience of going from the knowing intellectually to the knowing doing, and giving them that opportunity or that open door to walk through in terms of looking after their health and their body.
100%. Like I don't think that what we're going to be delivering could marry any better than what it is. Because intellectually, like emotionally, like we're literally going to be touching upon so much, the science, the actual real tangible results that can be achieved, and owning that and stepping into your power, into your identity of who you actually are. Because a lot of my own recovery, it was determining, who am I really? Who am I when I'm not in this relationship? And the process of self-discovery, the process of self-determination of who is it that I want to be, now that I don't want to say free, able to be who I want to be. And how do I own that now? And I think a lot of the value we're going to be able to bring is obviously a lot of healing, a lot of healing from all of it, mental, the whole shebang, so everything that Tanya's already spoken about, and then layering it in with the tools of all the pillars that I'm then able to teach and speak about, which is basically designing your life from then on. It's like stepping into that new identity, or your true identity of who you really are at your soul's core, and creating those habits, creating those aspects of your life that you're going to take control and charge over for yourself. Loving yourself, and giving yourself permission to do so. And we want to make sure that people actually leave with a plan, with the knowledge, with the tools, with the plan to execute and to do it.
And the other thing that I want to add to that is that it's a really beautiful thing, and I think this is what I've experienced, it's what other clients of yours have experienced as well, where the person that you know yourself to be on the inside and the person that you're seeing or other people are seeing are congruent, like it matches. And there's such relief when we're kind of matching externally who we're presenting and who we know ourselves to be internally on the inside. And that's really what I would love people to walk away from this workshop with, is that is possible. That is actually possible. I never knew it was until I started working with you. I thought that was just a dream, or it was just something that people kind of said that you could do, but they were famous, and it's like, oh, of course you can do it. You've got all the stuff around you to be able to do it. But it doesn't have to be like that at all. You know, like we can all reclaim our body and our health, and to be able to have that expression of ourselves, how we truly believe ourselves to be, that's really valuable. Yeah. So I know people are going to walk away with understanding that it's possible, but also, like you said, that little toolkit and some actual physical stuff that they can take away with them to start that process.
Yeah. It's definitely valuable, you know, and I attribute, like, I often been told how I can be so relatable to people and their circumstances, you know, and especially in the work that I do, because a lot of people come, I just want to lose some weight, or I want to do this, and I just feel like I've got a really beautiful knack for seeing potential in people that they don't see, and I really get a lot of fulfillment in being able to expand people's expectations on what they're able to achieve. I really do. I mean, Tanya knows it firsthand. Like, I get so much fulfillment from that, from just being able to expand people's beliefs and expectations, and then supporting through that process, so that when you finally, you know, get to see that glimpse of who you're truly supposed to be, or able to be, should I say, and just seeing that in your eyes, like, that is just magic for me. And that's really beautiful, you know, to have someone that sees and believes in your potential before you do. That's the power, I think, of what you offer people. And definitely what I want, you know, what I want people to experience when they're coming into this workshop, because I know they're going to get that just naturally from you. You see people's potential, and it kind of gives them something to move towards. So thank you for your beautiful gift in that. I love it. It's been really helpful for me personally, so thank you. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to this. I think this is going to be a transformational, life-changing half-day workshop. So that's coming up on April 15th, just to put that in there, guys. If this resonates for you, or if you know of someone who you think would really value from this experience, and it will be an experience, please contact either of us, and we'll take care of it, take care of you. So in final remarks, Tanya, what does summoning your superhuman mean to you? Oh, that's a very good question, isn't it? Well, I think for me, it's very in line with what we were just talking about, you know. So summoning my superhuman power would really be about, I guess, believing in my own potential and like working towards that, really moving towards that, while at the same time knowing that that's going to keep changing. You know, that there's growth in that. It's not a static thing that I move towards, but then when I meet that potential, there's probably going to be another potential that I become aware of that I want to meet. So I think being aware of that process and, you know, internally being brave enough, you know, having that courage to go, I actually have that potential to get to this thing, or to be that person, or to have this certain thing. There's a potential there, and that process of moving towards it, to me, that's the magic of being human, isn't it? Like, to me, that's a very magical process, and I love that. So I think for me, that's what it would be. Nice. All right. Well, I think that's we've said so much. Thank you so much for your time today. I'm glad we finally got to tee this up, and 2 more weeks. We're really going to do something really incredible. And but yes, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for having me. And I'll put everywhere you can connect with Tanya in the show notes, guys. I'm not going to do a summary because this is just amazing on its own. I think I think that you have a good sense of who Tanya is as on a personal and professional level. She is certainly a superhuman who is exercising her right to be her best. And it's only just going onwards and upwards from here. So till next time, superhuman, strengthen your mind, body, and soul muscles, and stay amazing.